Just this morning I saw the freeze response. So I looked out of my window and I saw a squirrel moving steadily along the top of a fence. And as I opened the window, it heard me. And I guess I was a potential predator as far as it was concerned, and it froze. And eventually, when it had presumably deemed me not too much of a threat, it reanimated and scurried off into some trees. But what if it had felt as though it couldn't go from the freeze response to action? So one client, Kathy, came to see me with a terrible height phobia. And I asked her when it had begun, and she'd been in China and had been taken up to the top of a towering building, maybe 150 meters high, where a glass sky bridge connected to another part of the building. And the transparent floor, she told me, made it feel like there was nothing between me and the streets below, she said. So Kathy had previously been fine with heights, but halfway across this precipitous transparent bridge, she'd frozen as though glued to the spot. In effect, her limbic system was screaming, "Don't move or you'll die." I couldn't move back then, she said. She said she couldn't move an inch. And when we've frozen once, we sort of fear that we're going to freeze again, that's going to happen to us again. So I worked with another client, I'll call June, and who'd been raped hundreds of times by an uncle decades before. Now she was going to see him again at a family gathering. Although he was very old and infirm by now, she still dreaded seeing him after so long, fearing that she might freeze and it all might happen again. So freezing, the freeze response, can make us feel powerless, unable to act, as though stuck in a nightmare. So what even is the freeze response? When is it useful and when is it maladaptive? We're used to thinking of panic as the rapid switching on of the fight or flight response. And certainly when we perceive a threat, a great height, even if we know on a cognitive level that we're safe, any sudden shock or even just surprise will tend to make us react by either going into fight or flight, or maybe a combination of the two. Our breathing quickens, or we may forget to breathe, our pulse rate shoots up, our heart beats faster so we can exercise in fighting or fleeing, and so forth. But just before this happens, we freeze. So why do we do that? So imagine that you're at home, say in your apartment, and you get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, and you believe you're home alone, but suddenly you hear what sounds like movement from another room. So who's that? And you freeze to listen. Perhaps only your eyes move. In that initial moment at which we become aware of a potential threat, our attention becomes totally orientated towards that threat, just like a mesmerized squirrel. This sometimes is known as the orientation response. We do this for a couple of reasons. First, to give us time to assess the situation. What's going on here? What do I need to do? This freezing may be extremely brief and happen just before we spring into action, go into the fight or flight response. Second, freezing can make us invisible to potential predators. Many larger predators, such as lions and tigers, detect their prey mainly through their movement. So if we stop moving, we become, to all intents and purposes, invisible to them. Once, when I was describing the freeze response to some trainee therapists, one of them told me that how he'd actually come across a tiger in a forest in India, and he said that he'd frozen, and eventually the tiger had moved on without attacking him. So clearly the freeze response has survival value. It helps us assess the situation, if only for a few milliseconds, and it may even help us blend into the landscape so we're not detected by some nasty predator. But what happens when a maladaptive freezing happens? When a threat is detected, it can feel as if we go straight into fight or flight. You know, we run away or we defend ourselves. But as blindingly brief as it may be, that freeze part of the process is always there. The problem arises when we get stuck in the freeze response. So Kathy had to be rescued from the high bridge, and she felt she literally couldn't move. Freeze had turned into something else. Kathy had sunk into a state of tonic immobility, a trance-like state in which she was effectively paralyzed, catalepsy. In this state, people may even be unable to speak or insensitive to outside stimuli. So tonic immobility is different from the freeze state, in which the heart rate slows for a moment. In tonic immobility, heart rate speeds up. Tonic immobility has long been observed in animals, but has also been documented in people, of course. The person appears to be inactive, but on the inside is extremely aroused, terrified. This is more likely to happen when a person is or feels trapped by the situation. Survivors of childhood abuse often really were trapped and powerless during that abuse by a much larger adult. Freezing, with its analgesic properties and capacity to help us feel detached through disassociation, may have been a kind of defense mechanism. But there may be another important but often overlooked adaptive quality to the prolonged freeze state. So if you picture someone being suddenly trapped underground after an earthquake, or literally trapped in the jaws of a predator, there's no option to fight or flee. The natural adaptive purpose of tonic immobility, that third route from freeze, may be that an animal captured but not yet badly injured by a bigger animal may appear to be dead. So the predator may then release its prey by putting it down for a moment, giving it a chance to come back to life and escape. Okay. It might also be that there are some analgesic benefits to tonic immobility, so that if the creature is killed, it may at least not suffer so much pain. However, if the creature does survive, something strange may happen. Once the immobility is past, the animal, or human, may exhibit vast amounts of emotion, a kind of shaking off of the energy that was stored during the zombie state of tonic immobility. So one client, Brian, told me how during the Ladbroke Grove rail crash, he'd been trapped beneath bodies and unable to flee the wreck. And he fully believed he was going to die. And even after rescue, he'd felt unable to move, frozen. But then he told me that he'd started shaking uncontrollably, like he was having some kind of fit, he told me, and eventually it passed. So Brian had, in effect, been caught in the jaws, so to speak, of the situation. The situation was the predator, so to speak, and his freeze response turned into tonic immobility. Even in the absence of serious physical injury, he'd felt paralyzed, unable to move or react, even for a little while after actually being rescued. So we don't seek to cure the freeze response or its prolonged cousin, tonic immobility, any more than we can cure any natural reflex. But we can help align it so that it only happens when it really needs to happen. So clients may report a freeze when someone unexpectedly asks them to speak publicly, or when talking to someone they're very attracted to. Or a more severe freeze may happen during a flashback or faulty pattern match in a traumatized client. A client may feel trapped again, a kind of natural and spontaneous hypnotic regression, which is what a flashback is. Not only when a faulty pattern match occurs, when a firework reminds a traumatized war veteran of warfare, for example, but sometimes even when they talk about what happened. So this is one reason why for some people trauma therapy needs to be non-voyeuristic. In other words, we may need to work without having our client recount in too much detail what happened to them. So how do we help our clients overcome maladaptive freezing? So firstly, step one, we can normalize the freeze response for them. So Kathy, who was frozen high on the glass sky bridge in China, felt that she must have been going crazy, as she put it, to freeze like that. And I described how freezing is a natural response, and why freezing happens, not just in us, but in animals too. And she actually laughed when I described how a squirrel might freeze when it becomes aware of us, and she recognized that. I described why freezing happens, and even a little about tonic immobility and the playing dead response, which can have huge survival value. So it made sense to her, and therefore reassured her that she wasn't going mad, as she put it. So next is perhaps the most important step in curing a faulty freeze response. So step two, we need to decondition the trauma. So if the freeze response has become an ongoing problem for your client, Kathy had started to freeze just thinking about going up a high building, it simply means the limbic system, the emotional mind, is overgeneralizing, seeing threat not just where it does exist, but where it doesn't as well. It's also an indication that the mind needs to process the trauma. So the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder can drop away when we use a safe and comfortable method like the rewind technique to decondition trauma. It seems that difficult memories are released from the grip of the amygdala, the fight or flight part of the brain, and moved into the neocortex, where long-term memories reside. So the memories are then said to be de-traumatized. They feel more distant and much less threatening and longer ago, and so on. So Brian, the client who'd been trapped in the Ladbroke Grove rail disaster, had subsequently found himself freezing whenever he saw a train. But after we'd processed the trauma using rewind, he found this no longer happened. And in fact, the police officer who had arranged for me to visit him told me he was able to get back on a train the next day after we deconditioned the trauma. No more freeze response. So when I spoke to Brian a few weeks later, he told me that not only had the freeze response stopped, but so had the flashbacks and nightmares. So when freezing occurs as a facet of PTSD, we can expect it to lift once the trauma is successfully treated. And lastly, I want to address the general sense of paralysis that may be preventing your client from moving forward in their life. So step 3, helping stuck clients. Some clients can almost feel frozen in life in a general sense. This may be a symptom of learned helplessness from a time they were genuinely trapped, either physically, as Brian had been, or by general life circumstances, as in the case of Sally, who told me that since her acrimonious divorce 5 years earlier, she had felt rooted to the spot and unable to move forward, which are curiously enough both good descriptions of the freeze response and tonic immobility. It's almost as though the paralysis of the freeze response can exert a kind of continuum of influence, where at one end we have a sense of being literally frozen to the spot, and at the other we have a feeling of being unable to move on in our life. Being stuck, unable to get on with life, full of procrastination, indecision and hesitancy, can also become a habit of being. So with Sally, I did find that once I'd helped her overcome some of the horrible memories of her divorce, she started to feel freed up to move on with her life again. So the kind of freezing she had been experiencing was partly due to a general loss of confidence, but also what's known as sub-threshold traumas from that time. So what I'm talking about here isn't the freeze response proper, but it does have echoes of the freeze response in the way that the person's living their life. We can help such stuck clients visualize more movement in their lives, both literally in the form of exercise and in the sense of forming and achieving goals, actionable and achievable goals. As well, we can deal with any difficult past experiences which may have contributed to the stalling in their progress in life. And we can help such clients, get moving. In fact, one study found that people feeling emotionally unstable, for whatever reason, have less positive attitudes towards action and more positive attitudes towards inaction. So the researchers argue that helping people feel more positive about action and be more proactive could help them feel more emotionally stable. Anyway, Sally started jogging every morning and literally moving more. She applied for a degree placement at the Open University. She planned a vacation. She socialized more and she started dating again. She was moving, no longer stuck by, as she put it, the crap of the past. And that wee squirrel on the fence this morning was only doing what was natural for it. Sometimes in a confusing and threatening world, we do the same until such time as we can fight or flee or change the situation, however that happens. And it may be that this unfreezing happens for your clients because of you.